Hello and welcome to another episode of Headline Canada. Today we have in conversation with us the Conservative Member Parliament, Garnett, who represents Sherwood Park and Fort Saskatchewan riding of Alberta. Welcome to our show.
Thank you. Great to be with you today.
Pleasure. Let's begin with your first political influence. What inspired you to enter politics at such a young age?
Well, my parents were very engaged with politics, but in particular it was the influence of my grandparents that shaped my awareness of the importance of being involved in the way that I've become. My grandmother was a Holocaust survivor. Her father was Jewish. She was living in Germany during the Second World War. And so because of her experience, we grew up with a strong sense of what can happen when government goes very badly, of injustice, of the importance of defending the rights of minorities, and that's something that significantly informs the political work I do today, advocating on behalf of the rights of persecuted minorities, whether that's the minorities in Afghanistan that I think we're going to talk about, Rohingya in Burma, certain communities in China, Christians, Muslims, and others in China that are facing a real crackdown. It's because of the experience of my grandmother that I was exposed to from an early age the importance of that. My grandfather was an engineer who worked in Alberta during something called the National Energy Program, which was, the long and the short of it is a very ineffective economic policy that devastated Alberta's energy sector overnight. And that happened during the last Trudeau government. And so from the economic side as well, he made sure that we understood the importance of having policies in place that allowed people to work and earn their income and maintain their income and establish the stability that allowed working people to succeed and get ahead. So really from both of those perspectives, from a human rights, foreign policy perspective, and from an economic perspective, my grandparents shaped in us an understanding of the importance of being politically involved. Some people like politics, some people like it less, but all of us are affected by it. It's important to all of our lives. The taxes we pay, the quality of services that we receive, the way in which our country represents our values on the world stage, all these things are informed by politics, and that's what gave me the spark to realize, hey, this is important and this is worth diving into in a deeper way.
Absolutely. Before we start discussing the current affairs, I would definitely like to tell my viewers that MP Janice is one of the most outspoken parliamentarians, and I think you spoke about 100,000 words in your first year after being elected as a member parliament.
Yeah, there's no better training than just jumping in and doing it whenever you're in a new environment. And I hope to be re-elected. I'm running again in the next election, but at the same time, you never know. And I went in with the mentality that I've got 4 years in front of me. I want to make as much of a difference. I want to put out as many ideas that I think are important as I can during that period of time, and really use the position in the way that it's intended. And I've received a lot of support from our party to do that. And I guess the negative of that is that I've put a lot of emphasis on human rights, and there have been so many human rights problems that have required me to speak out. So it's really a matter of necessity as well when you see so many of the challenges happening around the world affecting different minority communities that I really felt the obligation to be very vocal and engaged on those issues.
Absolutely. MP Janice, most of your issues focus on international human rights issues and foreign affairs. What inspired you to be extremely active on human rights issues?
Part of my grandmother's story as well is that she, as someone who was politically exposed, who was in danger, had to hide and didn't have the privilege or the authority to speak out about these issues. But the reason she was able to survive is because other people who weren't from her community, but who had an empathy and an understanding of her situation, were willing to speak out for those who did not have a voice. People like Clemens von Galen, who was the Archbishop of Munster, the area where she was, who were bold and fearless in criticizing what the Nazis were doing. People in Western countries, people like Winston Churchill, who perceived the dangers that were presented by the Nazi regime and spoke out against it. And so for me, I look to people like von Galen, like Winston Churchill as models who were people like William Wilberforce 100 years before that, a bit more than 100 years before that, who spoke out against slavery and who weren't themselves affected by that issue, but who used their position of power and privilege to speak out for those who couldn't speak out for themselves. And recognizing how the survival of my own family was contingent on the willingness of people to speak out for those who didn't have a voice. I want to be someone that is a voice for those voiceless people, those voiceless here in Canada and those voiceless elsewhere, speaking out for people who maybe can't call my constituency office every day, but who have the value and dignity of being a human being and deserve to have their fundamental rights protected.
Coming to some of the current affairs, recently Liberal government has announced that they will bring Afghanistan minorities in early 2019. Even you tabled a petition which was signed by thousands of Canadians asking for a special program to help persecuted Afghanistan minorities, in particular the Sikhs and the Hindu communities.
So what we're seeing from the government right now is a positive step. It's a long time coming. It's a positive step, but there's a couple. There are more steps needed to come. I'll just maybe distinguish between a couple things here. There is the minority communities in Afghanistan, the Sikhs and Hindus, who are very vulnerable, and there are a few families from that community who have gone to India. Those families in India who were able to get out, they are going through the process. There have been delays, but now they will be able to be privately sponsored to come to Canada, and that's a very good thing. But there are many families who were not able to get out of Afghanistan at all, who are still in Afghanistan, who would struggle to even get as far as India. And what the petition spoke of is allowing for those people to make direct application to come to Canada through private sponsors, so it's not going to cost the taxpayer or society anything. It's coming from private sponsors, private donors who want to support this process of this still relatively small number of highly vulnerable refugees. If you create that special program allowing that direct sponsorship, it makes it much easier for them to come, and that was something that the previous Conservative government had committed to doing in the context of the last election. So the petition called for that, and that would deal with the vast majority of people that are in this situation of vulnerability. So good step, but it doesn't realize the specific ask in the petition, and we'll see how the government responds to that in terms of the families that are still in Afghanistan.
In fact, my next question was about the government-sponsored refugees, but you have already answered it. I would like to add here that one of your first statements were actually about the plight of Sikhs and Hindu in Afghanistan.
Yes, it was one of my very first statements. I was elected in October of 2015, and this was a statement I made in December 2015. And it followed the tragic death of Manmeet Bhullar, who was a former provincial Conservative cabinet minister in Alberta, who was killed in a car accident. And I had immediately before that just become aware of the Afghan situation, and I had directed my staff to reach out to him to get a meeting, and that meeting never happened because of this terrible event. But you know, this was the last major cause that Manmeet took on, and I think his untimely death brought further attention to this issue, this cause that he'd taken on, and it inspired others to take up the torch. So it was in that context that I made that statement, recognizing his legacy as a minister in the Alberta government, and also this cause in particular that was very near to his heart.
Absolutely. Government is bringing the refugees in 2019, and those were settled and particularly sponsored by the Manmeet Bhullar Foundation. But do you think that it took actually long time to take this decision?
Well, there were significant delays, and I had written to the minister in the summer of this past year asking, okay, what are the source of these delays? And up until a certain point, a lot of the advocacy was happening internally. I had made that statement in public, but you know, sometimes you want to be advocating publicly and putting public pressure. Sometimes it makes more sense to put that pressure on internally. So there was a number of years of internal pressure, and that didn't really seem to be bearing fruit. And then in the fall, we changed tactics a little bit, and there was more of that public pressure. And our party, the Conservatives in general, but our leader Andrew Scheer, when he was in India, he met with Afghan families who were there, and I think that brought more attention and pressure to the issue. We did the petition, and then finally the government took the step that they did. So, you know, the process on that front has moved along, but there still is more work to be done.
MP Janice will continue this chat, but right after a short break. Welcome back after the break. We have in conversation with us Conservative Member Parliament Garnett Janice. MP Janice talking about some of the most important and recent issues of Canada. Liberals have recently legalized marijuana, but Conservatives have opposed the legalization. What's your view on that? Or if you can tell us on behalf of the Conservative Party, how the party will deal with this in upcoming federal elections?
Well, we opposed the legalization all the way along, and you know, we thought this was a strange priority for the government to put such a big emphasis on when there's so many other issues going on. There's a lot of concerns about enforcement, about whether or not we're ready for it. I know there's a lot of concern about impairment. I come from a riding in a province where there's a lot of industrial work in the energy sector, so there's concern about impairment on the job site and the impact of that, but also across the country there's concern about impairment on the roads. And the challenges around enforcement of those limits that have put in place, just because of the uncertainty around the correlation between what you might be able to test for and the actual level of impairment. The way in which marijuana acts on your body is different, for instance, from something like alcohol, where there's a very clean, clear-cut test of impairment based on your blood alcohol level. It's not the same with marijuana. So there are these big questions about our readiness and what the broader impacts are going to be. In terms of our response, the legalization happened this fall, and the election is about a year from now. So our commitment is to study that experience and to look at a range of different tools for trying to mitigate the harm. There is a point in which a new government can't always go back to the way things were. Once so much has been put in place, once people are employed and there's big investments being made, and also there's that dramatic change that has happened, it's not always prudent to try and go back to where we were before. But I think you know, we will see some of those problems, and there are steps we can take to mitigate those problems, to try and reduce the impact on neighborhoods, to protect kids. Right now, for instance, in the Liberals' legalization bill that they passed, there are no criminal penalties for someone who is underage possessing up to 5 grams of marijuana. And there are no penalties for one child to give it to another child in terms of criminal penalties. So that, I think, concerns a lot of parents, that if you have a 16 to 17-year-old who's giving marijuana to a 13 or 14-year-old, there is no criminal sanction that exists against that kind of distribution of marijuana among minors. It would be an offense if an adult was giving it to a minor, but the distribution among minors, the issues around home grow, where you know, the risk that if marijuana is being grown by people in their homes, there wouldn't be the same oversight, that it would ensure, it would provide easier access to children. So we've got to try and mitigate some of these harms at least, and we'll be rolling out some of the specifics around that as we observe the experience and closer to the election.
Okay. Also, Alberta government has recently announced oil production cut by 8.7%. Liberal is supporting their decision, but Conservative leader Andrew Scheer is blaming PM Justin Trudeau.
Yeah, the issue with the oil production cut is we shouldn't forget how we got here. It's not as if we're the victim of circumstances beyond our control. We have a situation where the global oil price, the price that countries around the world are paying, is much higher than the price being paid in North America. And that's because we don't have the transportation infrastructure that we need to get our energy resources into global markets. One of the first things the Liberals did when they took power is they killed the Northern Gateway project. And this would have been a critical project for getting our oil to international markets. It's a pipeline from around about where I live to Kitimat, which is a deep water port in northern British Columbia, and a deep water port would have created those opportunities for accessing international markets, for selling our energy resources to countries like Japan. Japan imports the overwhelming majority of its energy resources, mostly from the Middle East, going through the South China Sea. So they are very much in need of that security of supply, just to pick one example. And yet we're not able to effectively engage in those international markets, and we're getting lower prices for our oil as a result. The Liberals put forward Bill C-48, which creates a tanker exclusion zone, which says no export of those resources between the northern tip of Vancouver Island and the Alaska border. So even while you've got tankers coming off Alaska that are right in the same waters, Canada can't be involved in benefiting from the export of our oil resource. So this is not an accident. This is a policy choice. The government of Canada under Justin Trudeau has made policy choices that put Alberta in the situation it's in. And it's a very difficult situation. But regardless of how the Alberta government should respond, they have to make difficult decisions in light of the context of where we've been put. But the real solution is getting our oil to international markets, which means getting an east-west pipeline, getting that pipeline through northern British Columbia, so that we can actually be realizing the full value and benefit of those resources.
Absolutely, that was a difficult decision for Premier Rachel Notley to take. There was a survey done recently in Alberta, and Albertans mentioned that right now in Alberta the most important issues are pipelines or the economy, but other important issues like healthcare and education does not even come close. Will you somewhere address these issues, or will you work on these issues?
Well, the education piece is provincial, and healthcare is delivered at the provincial level, although there's obviously a federal role, federal involvement. And I think what you're seeing in Alberta in terms of those polls is when there's a situation of real concern about the state of the economy, people realize that there's a connection between that and the services that they can have. Because if you don't have a strong economy, the government isn't able to spend money on those resources, on those kinds of social services. And this is I think true at the federal level as well, that we have to take care of ensuring we have a strong economy, and that's what gives us the capacity to have a strong society. If we neglect the economic dimension, as I think sometimes is the mentality of some politicians on the other side, to say, well, we can pile taxes upon businesses, we can add regulations, add red tape. Well, who do you think is paying the taxes at the end of the day, right? We need to make sure that we're not creating dynamics where Canada is not a good place to invest. And you're seeing challenges in the energy sector. We're seeing challenges to the Ontario economy as well in terms of competitiveness. The Liberals are increasing taxes where other jurisdictions are lowering taxes, and that is making companies change how they make investment decisions, and that has an impact on Canadian jobs and a resulting impact on social services.
Thank you so much for sharing that information with us. And in the end, we would like to know, maybe it's a little early to ask, but we would like to know, how will your policy look like for the upcoming federal elections?
Well, we've gone through a very detailed and extensive consultation process in the development of our platform, and we're going to be rolling out a lot of those details closer to the election itself. But I think stay tuned, because the ideas that you'll see from our leader, Andrew Scheer, are reflective of a set of principles that I think is one that is widely shared with Canadians, which are that we need to strengthen the Canadian economy, strengthen Canadian society, and put individual people first in our decision-making process. We see a lot of greater expenditure from this current government, but a lot of that expenditure is going into things that people don't actually see, touch, feel, benefit from. It's going into things that are quite removed from people's practical lives. So I think we'll be able to put together a good suite of programs that will address people's desire to see greater affordability and also a stronger society as part of that.
Thank you, MP Janice, for joining us. It was really a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you.
Thank you.